Welcome back to Old School Sports and our Out of the Park Baseball 24 playthrough of the Buffalo Wings. And we are about to begin the 2044 to 2045 offseason. And fortunately, our Buffalo Wings are beginning this offseason from a position of strength. Went 104-58 during the regular season this past year, the best record in baseball. And more importantly than that, when all was said and done, our Buffalo Wings were the World Series champions for the fourth time in this playthrough, taking out the Cleveland Guardians 4-2 in the World Series. So as the offseason begins, we're feeling good about things because we're the world champions. And as you can see here, we've got almost $70 million to spend. With the beginning of this offseason, our market size grew to above average, which I believe is the second increase we've had in that metric over the course of this playthrough. It might even be the third at this point, but it's definitely at least two. And that expanded our budget to one of the biggest budgets in baseball. Now, we don't generally spend nearly as high a proportion on payroll as most other teams do, since we do invest heavily in scouting and player development, but we're approaching this offseason with the most payroll we've ever had. So what are you going to complain about, you ask? And it's not really a complaint, but it is just a couple of points that I think we need to think about in the context of all of this money that we have to spend. We do have a new owner now, Chris Ames, who took over after we got the new budget, and his fiscal personality is an economizer, and his priority is profit. So even though we're the defending World Series champs, he only wants us to play 500 ball. So I think this is very likely to be the high watermark of what we're dealing with in terms of our budget. So I don't necessarily want to go making a ton of large long-term commitments that hamstring us in the future, when it's very conceivable to me in 2 or 3 years our budget could be more like $230 million. But the other point that I think we need to consider before we get into our annual review of our roster and start planning for the offseason is that although we've got a lot of money to spend and not a ton of potential holes on our roster, the holes that we have to fill are big ones. Part of the reason we have this money available is that our longtime ace, Alexis Barajas, who was our number 2 starter this past year, opted out of his contract. And although he was, in theory, demoted to being our number 2 starter this year, he still led the team in wins, earned run average, and innings pitched. So that's a huge hole to fill. Our number 3 starter from this past season, Eric Barbarito, is also headed to free agency. And he was arguably our best pitcher during the postseason among our starters. So losing our number 2 and number 3 starters and adequately replacing both of them could cost a good chunk of this money. And then when we turn to our everyday players, we're going to be losing our first baseman, Mr. Rojas. All he did this past year was lead the team in home runs and runs batted in. And then we're also going to lose the outfielder, Josh Porter, who's arguably been the most talented overall outfielder on our team when you combine his defensive and his hitting skills, even though we at times have struggled to find him playing time, used him more as a platoon player, and his performance on the field hasn't always been what we think it should be when we look at his ratings, but still a pretty significant potential loss. So we've got some pretty big holes to fill with this money that we have available. And as I said, given that I think we're probably likely at the high water mark of our budget with this franchise, I'm going to try to be somewhat responsible in how we spend it this offseason. And before we get into the season review, and obviously you can see a lot of the highlights of the stats right on this team summary page here. Appreciate all of the kind words about the championship and all of the thoughts about what we should do with Deshaun Seifu this offseason. As I noted in the comments, I'm going to go with what the majority of commenters want us to do. Right now, it's a pretty close vote, but it's leaning towards keeping Seifu. I think I would actually retire him if the decision was mine. Part of that is just a pragmatic thought that I want to play through long enough to see whether Seifu is voted into the Hall of Fame or not, which means another at least 5 years if we retired him right now. And if we bring him back, that could be extending to 6 to 7 more years of play, given that it's early February. And I know that in a couple of months, my attention is going to be turning to OOTP 25. I just want to be realistic in what I try to bite off in the final stages of this series. So I think my inclination was probably to retire him just out of expediency more than anything else. But as I said, I'm going to go with what the majority of commenters want. And right now that's trending towards bringing him back. I would say vote early and often, but there's not so many commenters on our series that I can't manually compile the results myself. 1 vote for commenter. If you end up creating duplicate YouTube accounts so you can vote more, thank you for doing that. And I won't be looking to figure out if people have duplicate accounts somehow, but I can't imagine this issue is important enough to any of you that anyone will do that. But I am just going to go with what the majority of commenters want. As I mentioned at the end of our last episode, we're probably going to have a little bit of a break in episodes for this upcoming week. Obviously, you are watching or listening to our annual season wrap-up in this episode. And tomorrow on Sunday, we're going to post our review of our farm system and some former players like we do every year. And then there's probably going to be a break of about close to a week until our next episode. So plenty of time for me to continue thinking about what this team should do in the offseason. And those of you who haven't voted on what we should do with Deshaun Seifu to share your thoughts in the comments over the next week or so. And with that, let's take a look at what these world champion Buffalo Wings actually accomplished on the field this year. Team got off to a pretty slow start. At the end of May, our record was just 26-26. But after that, the team played incredibly with winning percentages of over 600 every month and over 700 in June, August, September, and October. And we ended up being pretty dominant in the playoffs as well, going a combined 11-3 in the NLDS, NLCS, and World Series. So when all was said and done, it was a pretty dominant run by the team. That 104-58 record was 3 games below Pythagorean expectations. We ended up 3rd in the National League in runs scored, in the top 5 or 6 in just about every pitching category, 6th in home runs, which is fine as far as I'm concerned. But as I noted, we are potentially losing our top home run hitter from last season. And the pitching, as it has been for really over a decade of game time now, was excellent. 1st in the National League in runs allowed, and we were 1st, 2nd, or 3rd in every major pitching category. Also 1st in both defensive efficiency and zone rating, and 3rd in both stolen bases and base running. So the team really did everything pretty well. The worst ranking we were in any of the major categories was 7th in extra base hits, and that's still in the top half of the National League. So a pretty good combination of fielding, base running, pitching, and batting led to World Series championship, which is the way that we try to draw it up. And this past season, it all happened to work out the way that we hoped it would. So we'll turn first to our pitching, which, as I noted, has been a strength of this franchise for a long time. Jim Lance, second-round pick from back in 2036, was promoted to be our number one starter this year. He went 13-7 with a 2.81 ERA, over 200 strikeouts, and he led the National League in WHIP for a second consecutive year with a WHIP of under 1. Put up a career best 5 WAR. He is in his arbitration years, looking for relatively big money at close to $14 million this year. Given that he's got another year after this where he's going to be at 18 or 19 million, there was an argument to try to sign him to a long-term contract. The issue, not really an issue because it's not unreasonable. Oh, I can't offer him a contract right now because I've already offered him arbitration. I'm like, why can't I find that? But the reason why I'm only offering him arbitration this year, and that I'm probably going to end up spending 18 to 20 million on him in arbitration next year, is that he's looking for a long-term contract at about $26 million a year at this point, which isn't unreasonable for a pitcher of his quality. But I don't think that that price is going to go up materially over the next 2 seasons. So in case he suffers some real significant injury, or in case our financial situation deteriorates markedly, want to kind of maintain a little bit of flexibility. My intent would be that 2 years from now, we would be locking him up to a long-term deal to be our ace for the rest of this playthrough. If it costs $25 million a year, or if it costs $30 million a year, I don't think either of those numbers would be off-putting to me, given how good Lance is. But given that we've kind of got the optionality to go year to year with him for these next couple seasons, and he is only normal in terms of his injury proneness, figure I don't want to necessarily lock ourselves into something, since when he's looking for mid to high 20 millions a year, not really getting much of a hometown discount by signing him early. We already talked about Barajas a bit. Led the National League with 18 wins, led the team with a 2.46 ERA and 183 innings pitched, and put up a 4.3 WAR. Would expect both Lance and Barajas to get some Cy Young Award votes this year. As we talked about, Barajas has opted out of the final year of his contract for $20 million. Given the amount of money we have to spend, and the fact that Barajas' ratings and performance are still both pretty strong, he's an Iron Man as far as his injury proneness, he's going to be in the mix for us to make an offer to bring back, despite the fact he's 36 years old. He's only looking for $22.7 million a year, so not much more than the $20 million he was going to make this year. He's just looking for some longer-term security. He wants a 6-year deal with a player option at the end. I don't know that I am willing to go to 6 years for a pitcher who's 36 years old, but the money doesn't scare me at all. And when I take a look at the prospective upcoming pitchers, we can see that Mr. Barajas, among starting pitchers, is right up there with Pete McLaughlin and Ron Whitmer as probably the 3 top guys. McLaughlin almost 34 years old, so he's about 2 years younger than Barajas. Normal in terms of his injury proneness, but also a pretty well accomplished pitcher. Doesn't throw quite as hard as Barajas. And then Ron Whitmer is younger, so that's positive. He's going to be turning 32 this offseason, coming off of a 9-12 year with a 4.45 ERA, but certainly has a profile that is pretty strong. So being able to lock up Barajas, who's kind of proven on our team for about $22 million a year, versus going after a McLaughlin or Whitmer, who are admittedly younger, but about $26 million a year for those two, and likely going to be looking for even more years than Barajas. Definitely some things for me to think about. If you've got strong opinions on any of the pitchers, it's always useful to hear what viewers are thinking. I don't think we could go wrong with Armfield, Whitmer, McLaughlin, or Barajas as our number 2 starter next year. As those of you who have watched me over the years know, though, I'm inclined to be somewhat loyal to the players who have been on our team in the past, which could end up meaning that we'll look to reunite with Barajas before he hits free agency, rather than going after one of those other pitchers who are on the market. I guess the other option, though, would be to let Barajas hit free agency. We could certainly give him a QO, and then we'd have an option to kind of go after all 3 players when we've maybe done another round of scouting on each of them. But Barajas certainly in the mix to come back. Barbarito, only 9-9 with a 4.24 ERA this year. But as I talked about, he was very good in the postseason for us this year. 3 starts, 2-0 record, 18 innings pitched with just 9 hits allowed, 1 walk, and 25 strikeouts. Put up a 1.00 ERA, a 0.79 Sierra, and a 1.2 WAR in just 3 games pitched. So he was certainly a big part of our success in the postseason, with an excellent outing in each of the 3 series that he pitched in. The issue with Barbarito is that he is also 30 years old, and he is not quite the pitcher in terms of his tools as someone like Barajas. He is, like Barajas, an Ironman as far as his injury proneness, which is valuable. But you can see he says he's looking for 7 years at over $21 million a year. So given that we know, or we think Barajas is better than Barbarito, even though he's older, and we think that there's 2 other pitchers who are going to be better than Barbarito as starters on the market, I think I'm inclined to move on from Barbarito. And given the money that it looks like he's looking for at this point, I think the comment to our last episode from multiple viewers to give him the qualifying offer makes a lot of sense. I think it's unlikely that he would accept it with the money and the years he's looking for. And even if he did accept it, I think he'd be very tradable. So I don't see Barbarito coming back to us next year. We do have the likes of Luis Palencia, as well as some of our young starters like Jim Coles in AAA, who can potentially fill spots in the starting rotation. So even though we're losing our 2 and our 3, I think my thought at this point is to only fill one of those spots in free agency. It will likely mean we let Barbarito go and we consider bringing Barajas back, or perhaps making a run at a McLaughlin or a Whitmer. But things can change. But in early stages, I think that's what my approach would be. And our 4th and 5th starters likely to both be back with us next year. Chris Lott, 26-year-old former first-rounder who's come up through our farm system, 10-11 with a 4.09 ERA. As a back-of-the-rotation type of guy, he's a pretty solid pitcher, and he is still making the major league minimum at this point. And then Simeon Manelli, 7-6 with a 3.64 ERA this year. Not quite as good as he was a year ago. Doesn't have the greatest stamina in the world, but has a good 4-pitch arsenal and above average stuff and movement on his pitches. He's also durable as far as his injury proneness, and we signed him to a long-term deal. He's kind of similar to our current stopper, Floyd Auclair, as well as Luis Palencia, who we mentioned. In a perfect world, I don't think he's in the rotation, but he's done a good job as a back end of the rotation guy for us, and will likely be back in the rotation this coming year, even though his stamina is not necessarily optimal to be a starter. We'll turn now to our bullpen, and the good news here is that pretty much everyone in the bullpen we can have back next year if we want, and our bullpen has been a consistent strength of this team. Joe Scott, we signed him this past offseason to a long-term, more accurately a medium-term deal, I guess, to be our closer. And he responded with a year that will certainly get him some votes for potentially his third Mariano Rivera Award. Went 6-8 with 51 saves, 2.89 ERA, and 102 strikeouts over 87 and a third innings. So in terms of the traditional closer metrics, he did really well. The reason why I'm not 100% confident he's going to win the Mariano Rivera Award is because of what Floyd Auclair gave us as a stopper this year. Led the league again with 89 games pitched and 37 holds, a 13-3 record, a ridiculous 227 strikeouts for a reliever in 143 and a third innings, 251 ERA, 164 ERA plus, 57 FIP minus, 1.76 SIERA, and a 4.3 WAR. As I talked about, he's similar to Minelli and Palencia, and that his stamina is not ideal for a starter, which is why we moved him into this high-volume closer role, and he has really excelled in his. We've had good stopper role. We've had really good stoppers over the last decade at this point with Auclair, before him Nate Ruckel, and before him Lauren Walborn, but I think that Auclair is probably the best of the bunch at this point. So I certainly expect that Auclair is going to get some pretty significant support for the Mariano Rivera Award as well. Nate Ruckel, who was our stopper before we gave that role to Auclair, has since being moved out of the stopper role 2 years ago, moved into a real valuable role for us as our top lefty out of the pen. 3.11 ERA with 27 holds, over 75 and a third innings for us this year. We've already exercised his option at $2 million for next year, so he'll be back with us at the age of 37. We've talked about Luis Palencia, another guy who could start for us if we needed him to. Put up a 2.69 ERA over 60 and a third innings pitched this year. Guy who's popular with the fans, fragile physically, similar to Minelli. He's signed for the long term with us at this point. So like having the flexibility of guys like Palencia, Auclair, and Minelli, who could start if we need, but also can give us a lot of high-quality innings in the bullpen. Kevin Hale is a guy that we had traded away last offseason, then we traded back for him during this season, and he did a good job with a 2 ERA over 27 innings pitched for us after we brought him back from Boston. I think he's got a role as a lefty in our bullpen for the next few seasons. He is finally arbitration eligible this year, but likely to only be making a little over $1 million, so he'll be back. Another lefty, Joe Warner, we traded for him last offseason. He went 7-0 with a 3.74 ERA over 74 and 2/3 innings. More of just a guy, but he's just a guy who's making the major league minimum. He's just a guy who does throw left-handed, and he's just a guy who can start or relieve. So expect that he'll be back with us as the third left-handed arm out of our bullpen next year, along with Ruckel and Hale. Mike Roberts, 26-year-old, come up through our system, had a 1.82 ERA, only pitched 39 and 2/3 innings this year, given the depth and quality of our rotation and some of the other guys in our bullpen. But he'll certainly be in the mix for a spot at the back end of the bullpen again next year. And a similar story for these other guys that we're going to talk about, the next two at least. Chris Powers, 31-year-old reliever who was a Rule 5 pick several years ago, 4.08 ERA over 53 innings, is a guy who's an Iron Man as far as his injury proneness and could start for us in a pinch with a 3-pitch arsenal. Juan Castaneda, along with Roberts and Powers, is going to be fighting for those last spot or two in the bullpen. Castaneda split this year between Albany and Buffalo, while with the big club struck out 32 batters in 30 and a third innings and put up a 2.67 ERA for us. And then Jim Coles is a guy who we brought up in September. Former first-round draft pick, had a tough introduction to the major leagues, a 5.79 ERA over 9 and a third innings. Most significantly, of the 8 hits that he allowed, 5 of them were home runs, so that explains the really poor ERA and the negative WAR, despite pitching just 9 and a third innings. But still think that he could potentially be in the mix to be our 5th or 4th starter next year. He's got some positive traits with his captain personality and is a great influence in the clubhouse. And looks like a guy with his 60 stamina, a 5-pitch arsenal, and average-ish to slightly above average stuff, movement and control. Certainly a guy who we would, at this point, be anticipating is probably our replacement for Barbarito in the bullpen, or in the rotation. So Coles probably takes over with a spot in the rotation for Barbarito. And then, as I mentioned, Barajas and the 2 big free agents who could be available are probably where we'd like to go to fill that other spot that we need to fill in the rotation next year. So our pitching, as it has been, was pretty good last year, and I feel like we've got a plan together, and we've got the money to execute on that plan to ensure that our pitching is going to be a strength again next season, even if 1 or 2 of the guys in our starting rotation may end up being different. And turning to our everyday players, and this is another area where we're probably not quite as strong as we are with our pitching, even though we did have a very good offensive season, as we talked about. But we've got some big decisions to make here as well. Catcher is not a spot where there's big decisions to make. We traded for Chris Malone last offseason. He probably doesn't love the fact that as a 27-year-old, he's gone from a starting catcher who was an all-star with Seattle a year ago to our backup. But he did a good job in that role, hitting .252 for us, 86 WRC plus, almost a win above replacement thanks to his solid defense. Getting a little expensive for a backup, looking for over $5 million, but do like the fact that if we needed to start him for an extended period of time, we'd be pretty comfortable doing that. And our de facto starter, Juan Ramirez, who we signed, is a international free agent a few years ago, set to make just $4.5 million for this upcoming season. So even though he'll be the starter, he'll be making a little less than his backup when all is said and done. But at about $10 million to have 2 above-average defensive catchers, we feel like we're in a pretty good spot at that position. Ramirez, 26 years old, an excellent defensive catcher, durable as far as his injury proneness. Did bat only .210 this year, but had a little pop with 20 doubles and 11 home runs and 439 at-bats. All said and done, it was a 79 WRC plus and a 1.9 WAR, largely driven by his really good defense. Pretty comfortable with this duo behind the plate for next year. Competent offensively and good to excellent defensively. Ramirez is durable, as we've talked about. Malone, although his normal injury proneness is only a backup unless Ramirez has some injuries. So pretty comfortable with where we're going to be at catcher for next season. I think eventually Ramirez will become arbitration eligible after this season, and Malone's number is going to keep going up. I think after this upcoming season, having both of them on the roster with the amount of money that they're likely to be looking to get paid gets a little bit untenable, perhaps. But for this upcoming year, we're going to run back the same catchers unless an unexpected opportunity emerges over the next few months. I mentioned earlier that Daniel Rojas led the team with 39 homers and 103 runs batted in this year. Also scored 103 runs, hit 270, and put up an excellent 157 WRC plus and a team best 6.2 WAR. He is headed to free agency. His 4-year, $120 million deal with us has been pretty successful. We got exactly what we were expecting with him as far as his regular season performance. Put up a 136 WRC plus over his 4 years in Buffalo, which was actually a point higher than his 135 career mark that he came in from the early stages of his career in Minnesota. Certainly a valuable bat for us that we don't want to lose, but he is a guy who's going to be turning 39 next year. He's not looking for quite as much money as his previous contract, $25 million a year over 3 years. So he's somewhat realistic about his age and what he likely will produce going forward. With the number of good young outfielders and potential first basemen / DHs we have in our system, particularly with the big addition of Reichert last offseason, I think I'm inclined to move on from Rojas, but he's still producing at a very high level, and he's not looking for a crazy number of years or a crazy amount of money. I'd prefer not to give that much money to a guy who's going to be turning 39 next year, but I can't say there's no chance of it. Speaking of giving money to a player who's older, Deshaun Seifu is going to be turning 41 next year. As we've talked about in great detail in previous episodes, finally seems like Father Time is beginning to catch up with Seifu. He ended up as a platoon player for us this past year. Overall hit 243. Did have 12 doubles and 4 triples in his 333 at-bats, and was 23 for 28 stealing bases. But when all was said and done, it was a 75 WRC plus, and he was below replacement level. We declined our $6 million option for him for next season after he decided not to retire. He is unplayable defensively at this point, but he's still an Iron Man. He's still fast. He's still a great influence in the clubhouse, and he's still a good bunter. But he's at the point where the only use he has, in my mind, when we look at these ratings, is as a designated hitter / leadoff hitter against left-handed pitching. He's only looking for a little over $2 million a year, but he does want a 3-year contract. As I noted earlier in this episode, I would be inclined to manually retire him, but I'm going to go with the majority of commenters and what they think we should do with him, which at this point is to bring him back for at least another year. I don't see myself playing him every day. I'm only going to play him against left-handed pitching, so he's only likely to get maybe 150 to 200 at-bats next year. Now, that could be enough at-bats, given that he's only 5 doubles away from 700 and 4 triples away from 200 to hit some very round numbers. He's also only 8 steals away from 1,300, so and he's 15 hits away from 3,200. So there's a chance that he hits some round numbers next year, even if he's only getting a couple hundred at-bats with us. But when I look at his batting splits from this past year, where he put up a 43 WRC plus against right-handed pitching, it's pretty hard for me to justify putting him in the lineup against righties, despite the fact that I wouldn't mind if some of his counting numbers got a little higher when his career was over. So Seifu likely is trending towards being back with us next year, unless more people in the comments section suggest that we just retire him. Don't think it's a make or break decision one way or the other, because if he is back with us, he's only going to be leading off in playing designated hitter against left-handed pitching. Alejandro Contreras is finally arbitration eligible. He hit just $167 for us as a utility infielder this year. I think he's been a good example of, if you've got a player with low adaptability and work ethic, even with a big investment in player development and excellent coaches like we have, hard to get players with those type of foundational personality traits to really reach their true potential. We still say here, as a guy who's going to be 29 in a couple months, that we think his eye, his home run power, and his contact could all be a little better. Realistically, I don't think those things are ever going to develop. We have made an offer to him in arbitration. Feel with his defensive skill and some degree of versatility, he's still a pretty useful middle infielder for a guy who's making a little over $1 million. So he'll likely be back with us next year. Next offseason, when presumably Fuchs will be much closer to the major leagues, probably going to be a more difficult conversation about Contreras' future with the organization. Danny Ferguson, who was our first-round pick 3 years ago in 2042, had his first full year in the majors as our starting second baseman, and pretty solid year. He only hit .243, but he did have 31 doubles, 13 home runs, and put up a 97 WRC plus and a 2.5 WAR when all was said and done. Respectable defensive player. In a perfect world, he's probably more of a third baseman than a second baseman, but for the time being, we're reasonably comfortable with him manning second base for us. Looking at his fielding stats this year, he was above average in terms of his zone rating and his defensive efficiency as a second baseman, which combined with a decent bat that we think at 23, closing in on 24 years old, still can get a little bit better. I think he's a pretty useful player for us. Speaking of useful players, and the reason that Ferguson won't be going to third base, Ramiro Medina, who we traded for 2 off seasons ago from Pittsburgh, really blossomed into one of the top third basemen in baseball this year. Hit .269 with 35 doubles, 5 triples, 27 home runs, drove in 98, scored 87, and he was also 30 of 35 on the base paths, all added up to a 123 WRC plus and a 5.1 WAR. He's been a solid defensive third baseman for us. Looking at the stats, above average zone rating, slightly above average defensive efficiency, and a really good bat with some good speed and some good bunting ability. He's headed to arbitration finally and set to make a little over $4 million. His long-term demands are a little high for what he is at this point, so we're going to still let him go year to year for the time being. But feeling pretty good about our second base and third base positions next year with the relatively young Ferguson and Medina in those positions. Josh Fuchs is going to be beginning next year in Double-A. We brought him up at the end of the year to have his glove on the team, but he hit just $169 with a sickly 28 WRC plus against major league pitching. We figured it would be a challenge for him when he looked at his batting ratings, so he'll be back in Double-A to start next year. Hopefully we'll promote him to Triple-A by July or August, and hopefully we'll see him again in the majors in September. If the bat develops to most of the potential that we think he has, you combine a bat that's got a little bit of pop and a decent ability to draw walks with an excellent defensive shortstop and a good personality in the clubhouse, and think that a year from now, with Fuchs at short, Ferguson at second, and Medina at third, we could have a pretty solid infield. And until Fuchs is ready, right now Mike Whitehead's going to be our shortstop. His arbitration number getting up there a little bit, over $4 million, in the $4.5 million range that we're going to end up paying him. But he did a yeoman's job for us at shortstop this year. Hit .275 with 20 doubles, 87 WRC plus, 1.8 WAR on the season. He was defensively slightly below average for a shortstop, but not critically so, with a minus 1.3 zone rating and a 990 defensive efficiency. Given that Fuchs is likely our answer at shortstop for the long term if things go well. Right now we've got Whitehead penciled in to be our starting shortstop next year, at least until September when Fuchs might be up. If there's a better defensive option available in the free agent market or the trade market, we'd consider looking at it. If we found a better shortstop for this upcoming season, then Whitehead and Contreras would be competing to be our utility infielder, and we'd likely look to trade away one of them. So when we think about our infield, we're feeling real good about second base and third base. We're kind of fine with shortstop and a utility infielder. The big question is kind of first base DH. Do we bring Seifu back, and do we consider bringing Rojas back, or do we perhaps move one of our outfielders to first base, which is definitely an option. In turning to those outfielders, Tim Boston, a left-handed outfielder we picked up in a trade with Boston last offseason, led the team with a .294 batting average, also had 27 doubles, 25 homers, 89 ribbies, added up to a 139 WRC plus. He's a left-handed hitter who we're likely only to play against right-handed pitching, but happy to have him back next year, still making the major league minimum, and he is a guy who could conceivably pivot to first base. He's not a particularly good defensive outfielder, could also be in the mix as a DH against right-handed pitching. Not an optimal first baseman defensively, but at 6'1", he could play there if we needed him to. We know he'll be back with us, and we know he's going to be in the lineup somewhere against right-handed pitching. Luis Coman-Duran is a guy who has a pretty good batting profile. Another guy who's a corner outfielder who could also play first base for us next year, and he would be at 6'2" with his ratings, certainly a more competent defensive first baseman than Boston. But Coman-Duran is not the greatest in the clubhouse, and after we finally signed him to an extension when he was heading into free agency this past offseason, it seems like his performance struggled. He was definitely better in the second half of the year, but when all was said and done, he still hit just .226 with 16 home runs and a 95 WRC plus. Certainly not what we were expecting or looking for from him. Set to make $17.5 million and $18 million each of the next 2 years, and then he's got a player option, and he would only consider a trade to the San Francisco Giants. So that makes it a bit tricky to try to get out from his contract. So we probably have to just hope that his performance is better next year. He's similar to Boston, a guy that we're happy to start against right-handed pitching, would prefer not to start at all against left-handed pitching. And given that at this point, the only team he's considering or willing to consider a trade to is his former team, the Giants, that definitely limits our flexibility to get out from his contract if we decided that we needed to. It's not a crippling contract. It's not even $20 million a year as we talked about, but given his performance this year and his unpleasant personality at times, in a perfect world, perhaps bringing back a Rojas while moving on from a Coma Duran would be an option that we'd like to have on the table. But I have shopped Coma Duran, and San Francisco is not interested, so there's really nothing we can do on that front right now. Talked about Josh Porter at the top of the episode, now a 31-year-old right-handed hitter. He's got a lot of positive things going for him. He's durable physically. He's got good range in the outfield. He's got good speed. And his batting profile, except for the fact that he strikes out a lot, is pretty positive. But we've struggled to find him playing time. He's definitely been better for us over these last couple of years when we've had him in more of a platoon role, playing primarily against left-handed pitching. He's put up a 156 and a 137 WRC plus for us in 250-ish at-bats the past couple of years. The year before, when he was an everyday player for us, he had a 95 WRC plus. Taking a look at his batting splits, this year he was pretty even between left-handed and right-handed pitching, which made him more valuable. But over the course of his major league career, you can see against left-handed pitching, he's put up a 138 WRC plus. Against right-handed pitching, he's still been productive, but significantly lower with a 117. So if we were to move on from Coma Duran, Porter would be a guy to consider. He's headed to free agency, though, and he's looking for Coma Duran kind of money at around $17 million a year. I think given that we've gotten a little more left-handed hitting centric in our lineup over the past offseason, with Fuchs in the mix, the trade for Boston, the trade for Reichert, and Canales now being a major leaguer, in addition to having Coma Duran back, there's an argument to try to bring back Porter. Maybe Porter is a guy that we bring back instead of Rojas. He's 7 or 8 years younger than Rojas, and he's going to cost less money than Rojas. And he also is, as we've talked about, a more than competent defensive outfielder. So if we were to bring Porter back and perhaps be playing him every day in a corner outfield spot, that could allow us to move Boston or Coma Duran over to first base. So I don't think there's a scenario where we bring both right-handed hitters, Rojas and Porter, back. But I can see a scenario where maybe we move on from the older player in Rojas, commit to giving Porter more significant playing time, and then pivot a Boston or a Coma Duran to first base going forward to open up a spot in the outfield for Mr. Porter to play more often. Ishmael Velasco is a guy who we really like, a good defensive center fielder, great personality. The fans love him, has some speed. His batting ratings don't jump off the page to you, but they're still a net positive, and he's a durable player. Coming off of another solid season, he hit 275, 37 doubles, league-leading 10 triples, 22 homers, 26 steals, added up to a 120 WRC plus, added up to a 5.5 WAR, which is the best mark of his career, even better than the mark he put up in his Rookie of the Year season 3 years ago. And he is at his best when the lights are the brightest, because he has been a member of both of our World Series championship teams, and he has also been the World Series MVP in both 2041 and 2044. So he was Rookie of the Year, All-Star, and World Series MVP as a rookie, and he's added his second World Series MVP this season. His contract is starting to get a bit more expensive. We're past the real bargain years since we signed him to that big deal several years ago. But no reason to think that he's not going to be our starting center fielder for several years to come. And we'll hope that he continues to be at his best in the World Series. And hopefully we'll get to another one with him. Edgar Canales, left-handed hitter, got a little bit more playing time this year, ended up hitting .259 with 21 doubles, 5 triples, and 9 homers and 382 at-bats, added up to a 104 WRC plus and a 2.1 WAR. View him, he's got good speed, high work ethic and intelligence, pretty good outfield range. Another guy who could be in the mix at first base, only 6 feet tall, but his range, error, and arm ratings are significantly better than we'd be having with someone like Seifu at that position next year. So as a left-handed hitter, he's certainly in the mix to be a 4th or 5th outfielder again for us next year. And it's not inconceivable that he could end up platooning with someone like Seifu at DH. He's definitely better hitter against right-handed pitching than Seifu is at this point. Having a guy like Canales on the team is why I just can't see any logical reason to consider playing Seifu against right-handed hitters as the designated hitter. So Canales possibly in the lineup next year against right-handed pitching. At the very least, will be back as a 4th or 5th outfielder for us and a solid left-handed pinch hitter off the bench. And speaking of solid left-handed hitters, Reichert, the number 4 prospect in baseball, came up and was very impressive, hitting .311 with 6 homers and 19 ribbies in his first 103 major league at-bats. Is not a great defensive outfielder, but another guy who will be in the mix to be a corner outfielder or perhaps move to first base. He can do a competentish job there. But Reichert is really about the bat. We've locked him up to a long-term deal, so he will likely be batting in the middle of our lineup for the rest of this playthrough in Buffalo. I think he can still get a little better in terms of his contact, his home run power, his eye. And he's also a pretty good hitter at this point already, we think, against left-handed pitching, and a potentially devastating offensive force against right-handed pitching. So really interested in seeing what Reichert's going to be able to do as a everyday player for us next year, and would expect that he will be a very strong contender for the 2045 National League Rookie of the Year. And before we finish up the episode, we'll give our worldwide scouting team the ability to see who could be some of the top upcoming free agents available as far as hitters. The 2 who really stand out as far as just incredible power bats are Mike Whitman and Ming Ya, both outfielders in their late 20s. The issue is they both have some not so favorable personality traits. Whitman is kind of a disaster to deal with, but he's durable, an excellent hitter, coming off a year where he hit .288 with 35 doubles, 5 triples, 25 homers, and a 124 WRC plus. Expected to be looking for 35, 36, 37 million a year. Ming Ya, 28-year-old left-handed hitting outfielder out of Australia. Low leadership, work ethic, often fails to run out plays, but still hit .284 with 43 homers and 123 ribbies this year. 152 WRC plus and a 4.8 WAR. So both of those guys are potential superstars. Like Whitman, looking for over $30 million. Second baseman Doug Nugent and second baseman Shamar Badio also looking for significant money, along with Andres Lezama. Roman Maples, who's a guy we thought about drafting many, many years ago, back in 2027. We picked Ali Ostendorf second overall. Maples went 8th to the Royals, and he spent his entire career there, is finally a free agent. Maples is a veteran with a good personality, a really good glove, not a great glove anymore at shortstop, but a really good glove at shortstop, and a solid major league bat. Guy coming off a year where he hit .291 with 34 doubles, 15 homers, and a 140 WRC plus, would seem to be an excellent plug-and-play guy for us if we wanted to upgrade at shortstop. My concern is that he's 36 years old and he's wrecked physically. So can we keep him in the lineup? We've got the money that we could spend $24 million on him. And if we could get 120 games out of him and guarantee that he was going to be healthy for the playoffs, that would clearly be a pretty significant upgrade to Mike Whitehead. I just don't know that we can guarantee that he's going to be healthy. Another guy to think about as far as defensive shortstops is Jaheim Lawal, a guy who we looked at this past offseason. He ended up going to the Mets, where he tied for the National League lead with 10 triples, ended up putting up a 93 WRC plus, a 1.3 WAR. He is not as good an offensive player as Maples, but he's still got 70 range as a shortstop. He could certainly upgrade that position for us defensively. He's fragile physically, 30 years old, looking for over $20 million. I don't think I would pay him that. But if a Lawal or a Maples happened to linger on the market, I think I would consider bringing one of them on board at a lower price point to maybe take over as our shortstop for 1 year as a bridge player to Fuchs, hopefully, who we think is a little better than what we were going to get from Whitehead this year if we were to bring a Maples or a Lawal on board. Can see a lot of other familiar names, Mitch Houlihan, Tyreek Hardage, Tim Gaglia, Bobby Bolig, Steve Anderson among the free agents. I don't think that any of them work for us. Shamar Badio, the 37-year-old second baseman, fragile, some negative personality traits, still a very good bat, doesn't really bring much defensively to the middle infield that we don't have already. With the money he's looking for, I don't think that's an option. Doug Nugent would certainly help our batting in the infield, but he's definitely more of a second baseman, and he's not a particularly good defensive second baseman. There's no way I'd want to play him at short. So as good a player as he is, with the fact he's looking for over $30 million a year, I think we stick with Ferguson at second base and Medina at third base. As we've talked about, I'll think about some of these shortstops. So the big decision to me is whether we chase after a Whitman or a since these are guys in their late 20s, in the prime of their career, that are excellent power hitters who could be available. With the money that they're both looking for and the fact that there's no guarantees they make it to the market, and the fact that both have low leadership and work ethic, and in some cases other negative personality traits such as being disruptive in the clubhouse, I'm a little inclined to think that we go after a Porter or a Rojas. Right now we've got Velasco in center, Coma Duran in left, Boston in right, Canales as a utility outfielder, and Reichert, the future Rookie of the Year, hopefully, as someone who's going to take over one of those corner outfield spots or perhaps slide to DH or first base. So there's really just one first base / corner outfield spot that I think we need to fill, particularly if we might be bringing back Deshaun Seifu. And although I think Whitman or in terms of production are probably better than Porter or Rojas at this point, they're both looking for significantly more money. They both have some negative personality traits. So my inclination right now is to either look to bring back Rojas at third base or at first base in the mid-20s for 3 years, or to commit to trying to get Porter more consistent playing time since he's looking for less money, $17.75 million over 4 years. Now he does want a player opt out after the first season and potentially for the fourth season, so it's not necessarily the most team-friendly contract. But he's good enough defensively that that would certainly allow us to pivot a Coma Duran, a Boston, or a Riker to first base and fill the hole that would be created by moving on from Rojas. Just given that Rojas is 38 years old, I think right now my inclination is probably to try to bring Josh Porter back, have him be an everyday left or right fielder for us. And then, as I said, move some of those corner outfielders with good bats who are less impressive defensively into potential first base and or designated hitter against right-handed pitcher type roles. Plenty of time for me to think about this. As I said, it's going to be a while till we really move forward from the offseason in real world time, close to a week probably until we'll be making these decisions. And that gives those of you who are still watching at this point, and if you are still watching and listening at this point, I do sincerely appreciate it. Thank you. Give all of you time to opine on what we should do in the debate between for that one final guy on our team who we want to be a corner outfield / first base type of bat. Do we bring back Rojas? Do we bring back Porter? Or do we perhaps go on the higher end for a Whitman or a Yeah and see if we can move, if we can fit a somewhat more difficult personality into our clubhouse successfully or not? Thoughts on that would be appreciated. As I said, right now I think I'm leaning towards Porter, but this is just off-the-cuff discussions in the middle of this episode rather than thinking about it deeply as I'm trying to fall asleep at night. And then any thoughts on shortstop too, Maples or Lawal? My inclination is to wait and see if the price on either of them comes down. I think either could be a nice bridge to Fuchs next year that would certainly upgrade us defensively from where we are at shortstop with Whitehead right now, and likely also upgrade us offensively from what we have with Whitehead. So I think either of those players could be an interesting option for us as well. But it's always helpful for me to hear what those of you who watch and think about these episodes are thinking we should do. And with that, we will call it an episode. As I said, we've got some interesting decisions to make this offseason with Barajas, Barbarito, Rojas, Porter, and Seifu, all potential free agents. So your thoughts on those topics and your thoughts on who among the potential free agents from other teams. And again, we're about 3 weeks away from the actual free agent market opening, so it's not inconceivable that some of these players we've looked at won't actually be available to us. But thoughts on what we should do with our free agents and thoughts with what we should do with the other potential free agents are always helpful. And in our next episode, we'll be back to take a look at our farm system, take a look at some of the top prospects around baseball, and also take a look and see what some of our former players did this past offseason. And the one thing we know for sure is that none of our former players were World Series champions, because we are still celebrating the 4th World Series title of the Buffalo Wings franchise here in the early days of November 2044. Until our next episode, thanks so much for watching, and hope you have a great day.